How It Would Be. A Pride and Prejudice birthday variation by Caroline Cartier. Read by Harry Frost. Chapter 1. Saturday, 8th March 1817. Pemberley, Derbyshire. Mamma, I am grieved to hear that you are feeling dissatisfied at Longbourn of late. I do agree that your letters have expressed your discontent these last 6 months at least, and I sympathize. You must feel so very much at loose ends since most of your daughters married and left home, and yet so very helpless at your difficulty in assisting Mary to find her happiness. I have done my best in inviting her to stay in London and in the country. All of our sisters have. But Mary has met no one who interests her, and indeed none I think worthy of her. Perhaps you should cease this worry for Mary. Not everyone is meant for marriage, though I do pray nightly to see Mary join that happy state one day. All of us have the means to look after her for the rest of her days, even Lydia, since Mr. Wickham won his prize money and promotion on the continent. So perhaps we all ought to let the matter rest, rather than belabouring it to excess. Instead of worrying about Mary, I invite you to join my family in Ramsgate this summer. You have always been at Longbourn. It need not be the fate of every married lady to be tied to her home forever after marriage. Your daughters have grown. You should travel and enjoy some society for yourself. Spend the summer in Ramsgate with us, Mamma. I do not delude myself that my father will make the journey, but my husband says we should be very happy to send the carriage for you and Mary. Jane and Bingley will join us as well. You have always said a bit of sea bathing would set you up forever. Before you leave, we will have a garden party in honour of your birthday in July, and you must allow it or I shall tell everyone that you turn 46 this summer. Your wicked girl, Lizzie. Fanny Bennet shook her head as she read her second eldest daughter's letter at her dressing table while dressing for dinner. Cease worrying about Mary, indeed. One might think that Lizzie did not even know her mother. Fanny had but one mission in her life, and that was to see to the welfare of each of her daughters. Just because her other daughters could afford to support her after their father's death, that did not mean Mary should not have her opportunity for happiness. What is more, Mary wished to be married. Fanny could see it as plain as day, though finally, as the last year passed, Fanny also started to see Mary cringe and turn away in pain each time Fanny referred to her unwedded state or her looks. What her husband, her eldest daughters, and her late mother-in-law had struggled to accomplish with Fanny's manner had finally taken effect when there were few others at home to ease matters between Fanny and her third daughter. Fanny finally became aware of others' reaction to her address. Once she had perceived Mary's cringes, she suddenly began to notice similar winces when she spoke with many people, except perhaps her sister. Fanny had slowly come to realize that she was rather too loud and too open, too ready to share matters that her family did not wish to bring to attention, and that her neighbors perhaps did not wish to hear. Once she started paying attention to what she said before she said it, she also paid more attention to the feelings of those around her, and she had seen for herself the pain her third daughter experienced when a local lady only newly debuted became quickly engaged, or yet another of the friends of her youth gave birth to yet another babe. Fanny was not a perfect woman. Even with her new understanding, old habits died hard, and she still found herself calling attention to herself more often than her remaining daughter wished. Fanny had not the slightest interest in Ramsgate, travelling, or birthday garden parties, nor could she possibly care less if her second daughter exposed her age to society. Not that Lizzie would ever do something so impolite. Once a woman had 5 daughters grown up and 6 grandchildren, she must give over thinking of her own vanity. She knew Lizzie was only teasing. Indeed, most of the locals in Meryton had known Fanny all of her life and remembered when she made her debut in the village. Her age was no secret amongst her acquaintance. She would, however, take any opportunity to put Mary in the path of new society. Over the last 5 years, Mary had visited Jane and Elizabeth in London and Derbyshire, and Kitty and Lydia in Haworth, but she had never visited a seaside resort. If Fanny believed for a moment that Mary was actually content in her unwedded state, she might have let the matter rest, and allowed that 4 out of 5 was well enough, as long as Mary was well looked after. But considering the great unspoken sadness that she knew her daughter carried, Fanny would use any occasion to further Mary's chances. As little as she personally cared for travel, it was obvious that she needed to see to Mary's future herself. She opened her small strong box and began to count the pin money she had saved since her other daughters married and her youngest had finally ceased asking for financial assistance. There was enough to buy Mary a new wardrobe, or there would be when she badgered Thomas for a bit more. They would go to Ramsgate, and Fanny would bear the indignity of a birthday picnic if necessary, in order to give Mary this opportunity. Monday, 10 March 1817. Longbourn, Meryton, Hertfordshire. Lizzie, your sister and I accept your invitation to Ramsgate. As you predicted, your father has no interest, but he offers to dear Darcy that he is glad to travel to London and watch over your library in your absence. The man is incorrigible. Now that the house is always quiet in the absence of Kitty, he rarely leaves his book-room. I believe he will order a day-bed for the room soon and make the occupation permanent. You wish for me not to worry for Mary, but I fear her wardrobe is not as fine as it ought to be for such a visit. She objects, but I am sending her to you in London on Thursday in your father's carriage when the horses are not wanted on the farm. You know she does not enjoy shopping with me. Perhaps an outing with you and your Aunt Gardiner will inspire her to order some pretty clothes. I trust you, Lizzie, to ensure the quality of her attire will exceed the expectations of those we will meet there. I have looked at Mary very closely of late, and I declare she is not plain at all, only made so by those dreadful browns and greys she insists on wearing, nor do the pale colours that her unmarried state requires suit her. I think if we tried some brighter colours she would look very well indeed. I leave it to you and your aunt to find suitable shades that will enhance her complexion. Your idea of a garden party sounds very pretty, my dear, but pray do not single me out for such attention. I only have one wish for my birthday, which is for the garden party you speak of to serve as Mary's wedding breakfast. I am sure she must do well in such a place as Ramsgate. I know just how it will be. Your Mamma. Chapter 2. Wednesday, 2nd July, 1817. Welcome, Mary. Elizabeth hugged her sister as the butler sent the footman up to the guest rooms with their luggage. Mamma, I'm so happy to see you looking so well. Come into the drawing room and see Jane. You have come just in time to greet the children before they return upstairs for their dinner. Mary accepted her sister's embrace, then followed her family into the drawing room to greet Jane and Charles, and began exclaiming over her sister's children. Mary had always enjoyed the company of her Gardiner cousins, and was equally delighted by her nieces and nephews. Mrs. Bennet was prodigiously proud of her grandchildren, and fussed over them until poor Fitzwilliam wailed for his mother. After a quarter hour of being duly admired by their aunt and grandmother, the children were collected by their nurses and returned to the nursery. Jane's children, Thomas, Sarah, and Jane, were ages 4, 2, and 5 months. Elizabeth's sons, Bennet and Fitzwilliam, were 3 years and 8 months. A tea trolley entered the room with the footman, and Mrs. Bennet chattered away as Elizabeth poured. I am quite put out that we could not persuade your father, Lizzie. I do think you might have done better bribing him with books. While a reader in the Darcy Library at Ramsgate will never find the selection tedious, neither is it of sufficient grandeur to entice a scholar like my father-in-law, observed Darcy. Perhaps Elizabeth or Mary might write to him about some rare volumes I could have brought here from London to tempt him before you depart, at least for a se'nnight. Lizzie and I have all manner of engagements planned for you. Jane took a biscuit from a tray and dipped it into her tea. Lizzie reserved an entire section of the coast for us for sea bathing, and we will attend the theatre. Mary, you recall the Musgroves, do you not? Elizabeth asked. At Mary's nod, she continued. They will join us for dinner tomorrow. I recall you being very friendly in town with their daughters, Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Hayter. Those two ladies are staying with their husbands, parents, and brother at the home of Mrs. Mary Musgrove's brother-in-law, Captain Wentworth. I remember the Musgroves and all their family very well. It will be pleasant indeed to see them again, Mary returned. I knew that Captain Wentworth lived near here with his sister and her husband. I kept a correspondence with Mrs. Wentworth before she died. What a terrible shame, Jane said. All of those years the two of them were apart, and when they could finally be together, poor Mrs. Wentworth dies in childbirth, leaving her poor husband and little girl all alone. Perhaps we should show Mother Bennet and Mary to their bedrooms. It is time we all dressed for dinner. Darcy raised an eyebrow at his wife and rose from his seat as Elizabeth took her mother's arm and led her and Mary up the stairs. As always, Mary's sister had assigned her a maid, and her belongings were already unpacked when she arrived at her room. She thought about the family they would dine with the following evening as she used the basin and the water in the pitcher to wash, and then arranged her possessions the way she liked them while she waited for the maid to return. Mary had actually met Captain Wentworth before the rest of his and his wife's family. He had been in London in the year 1812, when Mary was visiting Elizabeth not long after her marriage. He was a friend of Colonel Fitzwilliam, who was always at Darcy House when not on the continent. They saw a great deal of the captain for perhaps a month before he left to meet his sister and her husband at a house they leased in the country. He quite obviously enjoyed the company of ladies, and who could blame him, having been at sea for so many years? He was a bit of a flirt, and he flirted with her shamelessly, but she sensed that he was not at all a libertine. Mary would never have given him the slightest attention if she sensed he was a serious tease. The man was the strangest mix of her brothers-in-law Bingley and Darcy, with a bit of Colonel Fitzwilliam tossed in. Like Bingley, he was good-natured and ebullient, fun-loving, with an easy sense of humour. Like Darcy, she sensed a deep awareness and solemnity under his humour. This was a man who would be honourable and take his duties to heart. And, like Colonel Fitzwilliam, he carried himself with the air of a man who could be depended upon in any crisis, a true protector. Mary sensed a glimmer of ruthlessness in the gentleman that gave her the most alarming, yet delicious thrill. He was the first man she had ever been aware of in an elemental fashion. He was the only man she had ever been aware of in that manner. Aware could be the only word for it. Mary had been alarmingly conscious of Captain Wentworth's presence whenever he was near. He was all too ready to converse and make himself agreeable, and 5 years later Mary had to admit to herself that she had been rather starry-eyed in his presence, although it had led to nothing. Not long after he went away, his marriage to the second daughter of a baronet appeared in the papers. Mary learned later his wife was an old sweetheart that he had pined over for years. Mary met his wife the following year in London while visiting Jane for the season. The Bingley household were often in company with the Darcys, Colonel Fitzwilliam, and their friends. Elizabeth sincerely enjoyed the company of Mrs. Wentworth and Mrs. Musgrove. Captain Wentworth seemed different to Mary when they met again. No longer was he the light-hearted flirt. In that man's place was one with the same high-spirited humour, but he had eyes only for his wife, as a proper man ought. She felt a tinge of envy for the lady's good fortune at being favoured with such devotion, but no resentment could be held against Anne Elliot Wentworth, for she was the kindest and best of women. As the captain's demeanour had changed, so too changed Mary's reaction to him. Now another woman's husband, she no longer viewed him in that way. How could she? Mary sincerely valued Anne Wentworth's friendship and corresponded with her often when she returned to Longbourn. She wept when she heard of that lady's passing, a scant 3 years after her marriage, and sent a letter of condolence to her husband as was proper. Captain Wentworth sent a short but grateful reply for the friendship Mary had extended to his wife, and assured her that Anne had cherished their correspondence. Of course, they never communicated again, and Mary heard nothing further about him for the last 2 years. Mrs. Wentworth had been connected to the Musgroves through her younger sister, who was married to the Musgroves' son, Mr. Charles Musgrove. That gentleman's mother, Mrs. Musgrove, was a lovely, kind woman, and his father, Mr. Musgrove, was equally gentlemanly and kind in Mary's opinion. The couple's daughters were both married, and Mary had enjoyed their companionship many times when visiting Jane and Elizabeth in town, for the young matrons visited friends each season since they married, and their parents, missing their society, often followed them to the metropolis. Mary was looking forward to seeing all of them the following evening. Chapter 3. The following day, Elizabeth arranged to take Jane, Mary, and their mother on an open carriage tour of Ramsgate, and later a walk upon the shore. Mary found the sea overwhelming. How could anything be so vast? It was impossible to contemplate, and Mary was uncertain whether she would find enough courage to go sea-bathing. Elizabeth and Jane were uncommonly fond of the activity, and went thrice a week at least all summer, and also played with the children in the ocean in the Darcys' private cove. Mary was surprised to meet Elizabeth Elliot, the elder sister of her late friend Anne Wentworth, in the confectioner's shop. "Miss Elliot," she acknowledged, curtsying to the higher-ranking woman. They had only met once, and Mary was certain that the only reason she remembered the other woman was due to her general incivility. "Who is this person, my dear?" the older man who accompanied her asked his daughter, obviously admiring Mrs. Bennet's still handsome visage. "Good afternoon, Sir Walter. May I introduce my mother and sister to you?" Mary's sister Elizabeth spoke up from behind her. "Ah, yes, Mrs. Darcy. Please do." The baronet tilted his head. "Sir Walter Elliot and Miss Elliot, may I present my mother and sister, Mrs. Bennet and Miss Bennet of Longbourn in Hertfordshire." Elizabeth made the introduction. "Madam, you are the picture of loveliness." Sir Walter had a penchant for beauty, and judged nearly everyone he met by their looks and wealth, in that order. Mrs. Bennet tittered as Elizabeth took their leave, and the baronet and his daughter promised to attend her dinner faithfully. "Well, they are not pleasant people, but they are the guests of Lady Dalrymple, who was a friend of Darcy's mother. Considering their connection to the Musgroves and Captain Wentworth, we can hardly avoid them," Elizabeth informed them as they left the shop and turned towards the library. "I thought he was uncommonly pleasant," Mrs. Bennet ventured. Elizabeth laughed. "That is because you are still quite pretty, Mamma, and Sir Walter is excessively preoccupied with beauty and good looks. Hopefully, with you present, he will pay less attention to poor Jane, who does not appreciate his admiration." Fanny Bennet questioned Elizabeth relentlessly on their carriage ride back to the Darcys' palatial seaside cottage, and had already determined on the perfect husband for her daughter. That would be the very first unmarried man she met in Ramsgate, but he was titled, widowed, and lacked a proper heir. His property was under entailment, just as the Bennets' was. Mary was looking very pretty in her new gown selected by Elizabeth in London. She was certainly young and blooming enough to attract the man's notice, and demure and sensible enough to suit an older husband. If Mary married him and had a son, she would have this Kellynch Hall for security when the man died. Her second daughter had looked at her curiously as Fanny interrogated her, incapable of imagining that her mother's head might have been turned by the baronet's notice of her beauty, but answered all her questions without objection. It was obvious that his eldest daughter must be married off for Mary to find proper contentment, but Fanny was certain she could manage it. She had her work cut out for her this summer, but mark her words, Mary would be Lady Elliot by the garden party, and a suitor would be found for Miss Elliot, or Fanny Bennet would eat her bonnet. As Fanny entered the house with her daughters, she slipped into the dining-room and switched the place cards her second and third daughters had arranged for the evening. She placed Mary between Sir Walter and someone named Mrs. Hayter, and relegated a Mrs. Musgrove to dine next to Captain Wentworth. Fanny then found her daughters in the drawing-room, then herded Mary up to her room, where a difficult hour was spent forcing her third child to select an evening gown suitable for dining with a baronet. Mary had already selected a plain ivory gown, and although ivory did suit Mary's complexion very well, Mrs. Bennet prevailed. When Mary descended the stairs, she wore a lovely salmon taffeta, her grandmother's pearls, and her cheeks were becomingly pink from her mother's merciless abuse. Miss Bennet! Mary felt a wave of affection as Mrs. Hayter and Mrs. Bennet rushed to her side as she entered the drawing-room, and, with a warm smile, she greeted them in kind. Though they had both been married for years, both women were infectiously enthusiastic when they were together, and Mary enjoyed their company and that of their dear mother tremendously. "Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove?" Mary dipped a curtsy in front of her sister's guests before being swept into Mrs. Musgrove's warm embrace. "Miss Bennet, how very agreeable it is to see you again." Mrs. Musgrove held her out at arm's length and inspected her. "You are blooming, my dear. That shade suits you very well." "Thank you, madam." Mary smiled as Elizabeth conducted introductions between those guests who were unacquainted. When greetings had been exchanged, Mary sat between her two friends and engaged in conversation as Sir Walter headed straight for her mother. She glimpsed Mrs. Musgrove moving for the door and thought fleetingly that the lady must be visiting the retiring room. Her suspicion was confirmed when the lady returned a few moments later and joined Mrs. Bennet on the sofa. Captain Wentworth was in conversation near the window with Darcy and Bingley. Mary watched him covertly through her lashes as she conversed with her friends. Mrs. Bennet informed her gleefully of everything that had gone on in Ramsgate before Mary's arrival, and Mrs. Hayter solicited Mary's advice later that week at an appointment with the dressmaker to design a new pelisse in a red velvet for the following winter. Captain Wentworth gave her several long looks as he conversed with the other men. What did that mean? Mary wondered what he would be like now and how she would react to him as the widower of her friend. Before the butler announced that dinner was served, Mary observed Sir Walter slip from the drawing-room and return a few moments later, and wondered why the guests kept coming and going as they did. Sir Walter returned single-mindedly to his pursuit of Mrs. Bennet. Always a man with an eye for beauty, he was quickly captivated. For though Mrs. Bennet had given over thoughts of her own vanity, she was still an impossibly beautiful and well-preserved woman for her age. "Mrs. Bennet, I must say it is a rare delight to find a lady who retains such, youthful bloom as yourself. Time, that dreadful tyrant, has been uncommonly generous to you, madam. Why, you might pass for the elder sister of your charming daughters." Mrs. Bennet, safe from the eager man's advances between her second daughter and Mrs. Croft on a sofa, blushed furiously and fluttered her fan with a scandalized smile and attempted, unsuccessfully, to turn his attention to Mary. The guests did not realize, as Mary and Elizabeth quickly recognized, that the reason for the comings and goings from the drawing-room was displayed upon the table. Mary observed her sister looking quizzically at her guests as the gentlemen seated the ladies at the table, for it was not at all how Mary and Elizabeth had arranged it that morning. When Mrs. Musgrove left the drawing-room, she had slipped into the dining-room and seated Mary next to Captain Wentworth. When Sir Walter left the room, it had been to seat Mrs. Bennet next to himself and move Mrs. Musgrove back to Darcy's left. By some miracle, Lady Dalrymple's place by Darcy's right was untouched, for the lady was a stickler for ceremony, and Mrs. Bennet said nothing about the disruption of her plan to seat her third daughter next to the baronet, though she was rather piqued, and glared at her second daughter suspiciously. Mary had entered the drawing-room on the arm of Captain Bennet, and when seated at the table, was flustered to find Captain Wentworth on her left and Admiral Croft on her right. She had only met Admiral Croft and his wife, Captain Wentworth's sister, on one occasion, but she remembered them both as kind, happy people that she would be pleased to keep company with again. Captain Wentworth and his brother-in-law had gone into their estate as partners. Admiral Croft and his wife had no children, nor any expectation of future heirs, and so the two men purchased the place together. Their families would live there together, and Captain Wentworth's heir would inherit. For now his heir was his daughter Anne, unless he remarried and had a son. Mrs. Wentworth informed Mary of the specifics when the purchase was made. There was talk of inviting Mary to visit, but then Mrs. Wentworth fell with child and did not survive the experience. Mary exchanged letters with Mrs. Hayter and Mrs. Bennet infrequently. But their correspondence was no replacement for her friendship with their sister-in-law. After exchanging pleasantries with Admiral Croft for a few moments, Mary turned and looked up at Captain Wentworth, who was gazing at her impassively. Chapter 4. "Miss Bennet, I'm surprised to see you without a tome in your hand," Captain Wentworth said, as Elizabeth and Darcy smoothly cultivated conversations with their other guests. "Well, I might have a reputation for being bookish, but I do hope I have never been uncivil enough to bring a book to dinner." Mary laughed. "Perhaps with those in my own neighbourhood, whom I know so well, or amongst the superficial acquaintances of my sisters in town, I might bring a book to the drawing-room, but not with such excellent company as we have this evening. I was happy indeed to learn I would see Mrs. Hayter, Mrs. Bennet, and the Musgroves again." "And they were overjoyed to learn you would join us this summer. I agree the Musgroves and their progeny are all lovely people." Captain Wentworth brought his spoon to his lips. "Do you prefer books to most people?" "Of course." Mary sipped her wine. "Why would that be?" Captain Wentworth continued his line of questioning. Mary gazed at him thoughtfully. "Because words remain dependable. People do not." The captain inhaled sharply. "That was what she always used to say." "Anne," Mary breathed. "She admired your mind, Miss Bennet," Wentworth continued. "She valued your friendship more than you know." "I know we met but a few times, but I cherished her correspondence," replied Mary softly. "She was my dearest friend." Wentworth gave her a gentle smile. "She was mine, too." The two of them ate in companionable silence together until Sir Walter stood, slightly tipsy, and announced, A toast to beauty and preservation, to one whom time has smiled upon most favourably, to beauty that puts to shame the most elegant of ladies of Bath." The man landed back in his chair as Elizabeth tugged upon his elbow sharply. "Preservation, nothing," Mrs. Bennet tittered as she raised her glass. "I propose a toast to my Mary, to the true picture of youthful elegance and refinement." Mary raised her glass. "To the virtues of humility." Wentworth smirked in amusement as Mary's brother Darcy came to the rescue. "I second that. To the virtues of humility." Mr. Bingley and Mr. Musgrove fought in vain to stifle their mirth as Elizabeth desperately attempted to turn the subject from her mother's beauty. This, in turn, advanced the efforts of Mrs. Bennet, who was only interested in extolling the virtues of Mary's beauty and accomplishments, which did nothing but make Mary wish to sink into the floor and disappear. Later, in the drawing-room, Mary assisted Elizabeth in passing out cups of tea to the ladies, as she listened to the endless complaints of Mrs. Mary Musgrove, who imagined every sort of ailment upon herself, and moaned endlessly about the interference of her mother-in-law and husband in the care of her children. "She gives them so much cake they can scarcely be managed, and then grumbles that they are ill-behaved. Then she fusses to Charles, who gets them riled beyond anything when he troubles himself with them at all. And this is all while I am most sincerely ill," Mrs. Mary Musgrove fretted. "If only my dear sister Anne were still with us, she was so good at making them mind." Then Mary heard Mrs. Musgrove's side of the story. "It is very difficult to be so very often in company with people whose children are so ill-behaved that the only means of keeping them still is the temptation of more cake than is good for them. Charles could manage them very well if she would only concede to his superior knowledge of boys." Mary wondered what sort of people the Musgrove boys would grow into, with so many conflicting influences in their life. "Mary, you must be more friendly and obliging to Sir Walter," Fanny Bennet said, as she drew her third daughter away from the tea-cart and into a corner. Mary sighed. "Oh, Mamma, no," she begged. "Please do not push me at him. I do not like him at all." "What is there not to like?" Mrs. Bennet demanded. He has a title and is uncommonly well-featured for a man his age. You do not even see many young men who are so distinguished by good looks, except for perhaps your brothers. I must say my daughters have thus far displayed uncommon discernment in male beauty." "Mamma, I really must insist," Mary attempted, but Mrs. Bennet was having none of it. "You do as I say, Mary Bennet. I know just how it will be." Mrs. Bennet dragged Mary to the pianoforte and lightly shoved her onto the bench. "You should be grateful that your sisters got you those masters, for there is nothing in your performance to be ashamed of now. You look very well there. Be certain to play your loveliest piece. It is really too bad your hair is so dark. If you were blonde like Jane, you would look like an angel there in the candlelight." Mary turned away and began to play, not out of obedience, but out of frustration. Perhaps pounding the keys would help her to bite her tongue instead of snapping at her mother. Fanny was ready when the men returned to the drawing-room. She was not putting up with any more silly compliments to herself. Mary was the picture of youthful pulchritude, and Fanny would ensure that Sir Walter appreciated it. Her efforts failed miserably. "Sir Walter, I must beg you to turn the pages for Mary. She is so accomplished at the instrument. I am certain you must agree once you have heard her for yourself." Mary, cringing at the idea of her mother forcing this man to give her his attentions, fell into old habit and quickly began to play a light, airy tune suitable for dancing a reel. Sir Walter quickly materialized, but not to turn Mary's pages. "Mrs. Bennet, you must not stand here alone. You have inspired me, madam. Are you not yourself inspired to dance a reel?" "Certainly not," dismissed Mrs. Bennet. "I never dance. My nerves would not permit it. Now, if you will be so kind as to assist me, I shall not hear of it. If a lady such as yourself suffers from nerves, why, it is only because you do not dance often enough. Come now, I must see the bloom high on your cheekbones, my dear lady." The baronet pulled Mrs. Bennet out onto the floor. Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Hayter quickly lined up with their husbands, and Mary's brothers did not disappoint, taking to the floor with their wives with alacrity. No matter how Mrs. Bennet attempted to turn his interest, Sir Walter would not so much as look at Mary, and her daughters were both amused and appalled at the baronet's single-minded pursuit of their mother. Bingley was rather grateful that the baronet had moved on from praising his wife. Chapter 5. The following day, Mary made a goose of herself by refusing to enter the bathing machines with her sisters and mother. She simply could not allow herself to be pushed by a horse into such deep, vast water while inside a rickety wooden shack on wheels, and frankly she thought the lot of them were quite mad. She waved her family off on the shore and instructed them to enjoy themselves, promising Lizzie that she would at least dip her feet in the water later that day when they visited the private cove with the children. Then she set off for a long walk, knowing instinctively where she wished to visit first. She inquired in the street as to the direction of her intent and set off purposefully, relishing the delightful coastal breeze as she walked, allowing her bonnet to fall back from her face once she left the populated areas. After some 10 minutes of walking, Mary encountered a lane that crossed a field of lovely wild flowers. She continued along, using a small penknife that she carried in her pocket to cut a cheerful bouquet of Queen Anne's lace, mallow, and ragwort. She walked on, stopping once more for directions from a helpful farmer's wife just to be certain that she was going the right way, and purchased a small jar of preserves from the woman. Nearly 35 minutes after leaving her sisters, Mary entered Queen Oak's Court, the estate owned by Captain Wentworth and Admiral Croft, from a back lane, and continued through a small tenant village to the estate's church. She entered the churchyard, grateful that no one was near to question her presence. She walked amongst the stones, reading the history of the people who lived here before the Wentworths and their family, until she found what she was looking for. Wentworth. Beloved wife and mother, Anne, 1785 to 1815. Mary gazed at the final resting place of her friend for several long moments before sinking to her knees next to the grave. She laid the flowers before the stone and sat quietly for a time, thinking of her quiet, gentle friend and the confidences they had shared, mostly by post. It was a terrible injustice that a woman so beloved by her husband and her friends should be parted from them and her child to grow up without a mother, while women like Mary, spinsters that most would hardly even miss, should grow old and decay alone. She prayed for a short while, then promised her dear friend that she would visit again before she left Ramsgate. As she rose, she heard a low murmur behind her, followed by a tiny voice crying out, "Mamma!" Mary turned to find Captain Wentworth hesitating at the entrance of the churchyard, holding a small girl who had red eyes and a tear-stained face, and was pointing at her. "Captain, I apologize. I did not intend to disturb your privacy." "Please, Miss Bennet, you have nothing to apologize for." Captain Wentworth nodded to his wife's resting place. "I'm touched that you came." "I could not have done anything other than pay my respect." Mary dipped her head. "I see you and Miss Wentworth have also been flower-picking today." "Mamma!" the child cried again, reaching out for Mary. "Sometimes young Anne becomes fretful," the captain explained. "The doctor insists that she's not teething. The nurse agrees, but she believes that the child should be left to cry it out, and I cannot bear it. So, when we cannot settle, we go out to pick flowers and come to tell Mamma all about our troubles." "That seems eminently sensible to me," Mary said kindly. "Mamma!" the child squealed again, reaching for Mary as if her little life depended upon it. "Mamma!" "I apologize, Miss Bennet. Shortly after the purchase of Queen Oak's Court, I had several paintings of my wife commissioned. Little Anne only speaks a few words, but she has been spoken to of her dear Mamma often, and sees her likeness in our home every day. I believe your dark hair must have confused her." Wentworth struggled with the wriggling child in his arms. "I assure you I'm not at all offended." Mary held out her hands to the little girl. "May I?" "Of course." The captain handed over the child without hesitation. Mary felt her small forehead with the back of her free hand, then her lips, then looked into the girl's ears and tugged gently on one lobe, then the other. "I hesitate to feel her gums without washing first, but she's not drooling, nor is she feverish, so I agree with your doctor and nurse. She does not appear to be teething, and her ears do not seem hot or painful either. I have learned a great deal of such matters while visiting my aunt and sisters and their children." Mary stroked the girl's head for a moment, then began humming in a low tone, walking around in small circles. It was not long before the babe rested her head contentedly on Mary's shoulder. "You have a way with her." Wentworth was quietly awed. "She's grieving too, in her own way," Mary said softly. "She senses that someone important to her is missing, but has not the words to describe her longing for the connection." "I fear I do not either." Wentworth ran a hand over his face, looking tired. Mary glanced up at him. "Then perhaps unspoken understanding, a peaceful walk, and a field of wildflowers is the best kindness one can offer." He smiled at her insightfulness. "I thank God for Sophie, but I fear Anne is missing a mother." "Sophie is Mrs. Croft?" Mary asked, as he nodded in answer. "They must be a blessing to one another in so many ways, Mrs. Croft having no children, and poor Miss Wentworth needing a mother's love." "I am certain that is how my sister feels, though she would have preferred to be a blessing merely as a doting aunt and not a replacement mother," Wentworth affirmed. He looked about. "How did you arrive here, Miss Bennet?" "I walked." Mary pointed to the lane by which she had come. "Walked?" he said in confusion. "From where?" "I left my mother and sisters at the sea-bathing machines and found directions along the way," she answered. "But that must have taken you an hour. You must be exhausted," Wentworth exclaimed. "Oh, not at all. It was only a bit more than half of an hour, and I assure you I enjoy the exercise very much, especially in such a beautiful new setting," Mary promised. "What if you became too fatigued to continue?" Wentworth insisted. "What if you got lost?" "This reminds me of a tale your wife once shared with me by letter, of a long walk she took with you and your friends before you married, and they were still the Miss Musgroves." Mary smiled up at him. "She said you were quite the gallant." "Did she?" Wentworth lit up. "Indeed. She said that Mrs. Croft made an extra space in their phaeton by squeezing in close with her husband, and that you, noting Mrs. Wentworth's fatigue, saw her up and under the protection of your sister before anyone could lodge an objection." "I recall that day. I cannot believe that she told you about it." "I believe that she said she was not accustomed to such long exercise, and that was the day she realized that you still bore her goodwill." Mary had a thought, and then continued on. "You know, when I think of it, I do not believe there is anything that I consider particularly private in her correspondence to me. It occurs to me that it might bring you some comfort if I were to give you her letters to read. Your devotion meant the world to her. She mentioned you and her family here at Queen Oaks Court often." "I would be very grateful to see anything my wife shared with you that you do not deem too private, Miss Bennet." Wentworth bowed. "That is an exceedingly kind offer. But, even if you are more accustomed to long walks than my late wife, I must insist on sending you back to Darcy Cottage in my carriage." Mary objected, but he refused to be swayed. Young Anne had fallen asleep with her head on Mary's shoulder, and she transferred the child smoothly back to Wentworth's arms, then accompanied him back to the manor. There she was fussed over by Mrs. Croft and Mrs. Musgrove, fortified with tea and cakes, and later returned to Darcy Cottage in Captain Wentworth's carriage. She was accompanied by Mrs. Hayter and Mrs. Bennet, who were both eager to visit with her in the music room at her sister's house for the afternoon. Chapter 6. Over the next fortnight, the residents of Darcy Cottage, Queen Oaks Court, and Lady Dalrymple's fashionable leased mansion saw each other daily. The Darcys and their guests had dined at the homes of both of the other families, and Elizabeth and Jane kept busy with the planning of their mother's garden party. Fanny bade them to be as lavish as they liked, for she was certain that it would be just as she pictured it, and that the party would serve as Mary's wedding breakfast. Fanny and Mary Bennet kept themselves occupied. Fanny's behaviour in public had improved well enough that she got on very well with Mrs. Musgrove and Mrs. Croft, only allowing her enthusiasm to become vulgar once or twice, and not in public. Lady Dalrymple did not notice her, but then Fanny had no idea what to say to such an important person anyway. Most of the ladies went sea-bathing each day, the ladies of Queen Oaks Court often joining Elizabeth's guests on the private stretch of beach Elizabeth had reserved for the summer. Mary shopped with Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Hayter, walked on the promenade with Admiral and Mrs. Croft, and went sightseeing with Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove and their family in their shooting break. She read in the gardens, played in the Darcys' private cove with her sister's children, and dined with the families in Elizabeth's circle each night. Elizabeth kept her circle small in the summer. Though many of the families of the temps were in Ramsgate, the Darcys avoided most invitations and crowded events when they visited with their children. Since Elizabeth socialized and entertained appropriately in town, the other hostesses did not take it amiss, particularly since it was known that the Darcys had many relations visiting. Fanny Bennet was in high dudgeon. Nothing she said, nothing she did, was successful in making her daughter and Sir Walter Elliot notice one another, nor give each other the attention she required of them. Sir Walter was apparently something of a ladies' man, a typical nobleman who had not been faithful to his wife, and trifled often with those of other men, as well as good-looking widows. After having failed to lure Mrs. Bingley's devotion from her husband, the bounder was now attempting to chase Fanny, in the absence of Mr. Bennet. Baronet or not, Fanny had no interest in men at her age, unless one of those men was going to marry her last remaining single daughter. Once this goal was accomplished, Fanny cared not if she ever laid eyes on another man again, even her own husband. The other goal, which she had no intention of abandoning, was to find a suitor for Miss Elliot. The woman was worse than her son Bingley's dreadful sister, and thank heavens poor Jane had married that harridan off. Fanny would not see Mary's happiness marred by the rudeness of her future stepdaughter. No, it was obvious that Miss Elliot's best chances lay with her sister's husband. Who could be a more natural choice to raise a late woman's child than her loving sister? Today, Fanny was on the promenade in the company of Jane and Elizabeth, followed devotedly, of course, by Sir Walter and his daughter. Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Hayter strolled nearby with their mother, and Captain Wentworth lingered alone some distance away, swinging his walking-stick in the air and looking out over the sea. Fanny wondered if he ever missed being on board a ship. After a short while, Sir Walter and Miss Elliot were delayed by one of Lady Dalrymple's friends, and Fanny continued on with her two eldest daughters. "I do wish that Captain Wentworth would take one of my hints and pay the proper attention to his wife's sister." "Whatever do you mean, Mamma?" Elizabeth asked, as she took her mother's arm in Sir Walter's absence. Jane took up her other arm companionably, securing Fanny from being obliged to take that man's arm again if he returned to their group. "Well, it must be obvious to you, Lizzie, that Mary cannot very well have that sour-faced woman in her house when she marries Sir Walter, and Captain Wentworth is a poor widower with no wife to mother his little girl. Who better to love the poor mite than her mother's own dear sister?" "I knew Mrs. Wentworth and saw her in company with her sister on more than one occasion. I'm not certain that their relationship merited such tender fancies, Mamma," said Elizabeth. "Mamma, I am surprised at you," objected Jane. "You know it is considered very wrong for a man to marry his dead wife's sister. Is it not illegal?" "Oh, pish, Jane, of course it is not illegal." Fanny dismissed her daughter's claim. "That rear admiral we met last week at the home of Lady Dalrymple, Charles Austen was his name. His wife, Mrs. Harriet Austen, is the sister of his late wife. She told me so herself." Footnote 1. Jane Austen's brother Charles married his wife's sister after her death. This occurred in the year 1820, but we have borrowed the scenario for the benefit of this story. "It is usually only practiced by the poor, the middle class, and some tradesmen's families," Elizabeth corrected sternly. "Virtually anyone can legally contest the legitimacy of such a match and have it declared invalid for as long as 2 years after the wedding, on any basis. Even just the opinion of not wishing to live in the same village as such a couple. Miss Elliot would be risking her children's legitimacy in such a marriage if she had any." "I could never take such a risk, and I would not wish it on Miss Elliot, particularly not when she has her dowry and her family to rely on, and Mr. Wentworth has the loving support of his own dear sister to help him with his child." Jane shivered. "I think we are overlooking the most pertinent fact here, which is that Mary is not going to marry Sir Walter, nor should any of us wish her to." Elizabeth stopped and regarded her mother. "This is not why I invited you this summer, Mamma. The man is not loyal. He respects no one's wedding vows. Since arriving in Ramsgate, he has chased both you and Jane shamelessly, and you are both married women. Would you tie poor Mary to such a lecher?" "Indeed, Mamma. You worry for Mary's happiness living with Miss Elliot, but have you considered whether she would be happy being openly betrayed by her husband?" Jane agreed with her sister. "You two have never changed." Fanny Bennet walked on in a huff, her daughters catching up to her quickly. "Even after 5 years of marriage, your heads are still in the clouds." "You cannot claim that we do not understand the world or married life now," Elizabeth chided. "We are grown women, wives and mothers. We live amongst society, and we hear things in town, scandals that would shock you to hear. I will not be told that I do not understand what is at stake for Mary." "You can keep your counsel, Lizzie. I know very well how it all will be," Fanny said, silencing her daughters and marching on, her nose high in the air. Though Elizabeth Elliot had no thoughts of marrying her sister's widower, she did in fact have her own opinions regarding who would be acceptable to wed her sister's husband. Miss Elliot believed that only a woman of some rank was worthy to take her sister's place and raise her child. Wentworth might not have a title, but he was wealthy, and his heir would inherit a thriving estate. Miss Elliot felt that a woman of great refinement ought to be the one to mother her young niece, who, by the by, she had only visited thrice in the whole of the child's life. Miss Elliot had noticed her brother-in-law's quiet preoccupation with his dead wife's friend, and she saw no merit in such a match. So far, the pair had kept to lingering glances and short, murmured discussions that they shared with no one else. She would ensure that the inclination went no further. At least, that was what Miss Elliot thought, until she saw what Mrs. Bennet and her two elder daughters missed as they disagreed with one another by the sea. Miss Elliot watched as Miss Bennet approached, and Captain Wentworth greeted her with a gentle smile. She was filled with shock and outrage as Miss Bennet passed her brother-in-law a packet of letters, which he slipped into his coat without even glancing about to ensure that no one was watching. "That Jezebel!" Miss Elliot's gaze hardened. So, Miss Bennet wished to steal her sister's husband right under their noses without so much as a by your leave. The lady's audacity was too much to bear. Miss Elliot knew what to do. Tonight, at Mrs. Darcy's dinner, she would expose Miss Bennet to all as the scheming trollop she was. Then the Musgroves and all their party would be utterly disgusted by her forwardness. Chapter 7. Mary was looking very well that evening, having taken her mother's advice and worn the salmon taffeta again. She had learned, slowly, to allow her sisters and aunt to help her select clothes, and she was not bad at it herself now. She only avoided frivolous expenses such as bright frocks because of her circumstances. She was not wealthy enough to spend her pin money on a fine wardrobe. She saved as much as she could to sustain her at least for a time when her father died. Their usual group was present, all the residents and guests of Darcy Cottage, Queen Oaks Court, and Lady Dalrymple. Everyone except for Lady Dalrymple, Sir Walter, and Miss Elliot easily got along with everyone present. Darcy kept Lady Dalrymple happy and entertained, Sir Walter amused himself by following Mrs. Bennet about, and Miss Elliot spent her time wandering around the drawing-room. That lady did not like what she observed. Mary had just left Mrs. Musgrove, and saw that lady slip from the room. She wondered idly if that lady was the one who rearranged the place cards each time they dined together to ensure that Mary sat next to Captain Wentworth. It had occurred several times, and Mary noticed Lady Dalrymple looking annoyed by Mary's placement when they all attended her dinner party, for it happened at everyone's home. Captain Wentworth approached her, and she smiled. "Good evening, Captain." "Good evening, Miss Bennet." The captain bowed. "While I have the opportunity, I wish to thank you for your unexampled kindness to me and my daughter, both when we saw you in the churchyard and by your loan of the letters that my dear wife wrote to you. I shall copy them so Anne can enjoy them when she is grown, and then return them to you." "Please do not mention it," Mary insisted. "It is nothing, I assure you." "It is the very opposite of nothing, and it meant a great deal to me. I'm certain one day young Anne will agree." "She looks very like her mother," Mary ventured. "That must be painful." Wentworth nodded, inhaling shakily. "It was, at first. In the beginning I could scarcely bear to hold her. But Sophie insisted, and though people say that most babies look like their sires immediately following their birth, Anne was the very image of her mother. I could not consider giving her any other name. Sophie and Croft agreed." He ran his hand through his hair. "I confess the child does bring me a great deal of comfort, Miss Bennet, but raising her without her mother, I do not know how I shall bear it. I'm grateful that I have Sophie's support. I do not know what sort of father I would make left entirely to my own devices." Mary gave him a long look and said firmly, "You are a good father." He sucked in a sharp breath and looked at her as if he had never allowed himself to even consider what she said. "I wonder if she would agree." "She would." Mary touched his arm lightly. "She would, Captain Wentworth." Miss Elliot had seen enough. "Excuse me," But, Miss Bennet, would you be so kind as to remove your hand from the arm of my sister's widower? This set off gasps all over the room, and Mrs. Musgrove attempted to smooth over the moment, but Miss Elliot was having none of it. I beg everyone's pardon if I have shocked you, but I really must speak up regarding this woman's brazen pursuit of my brother. Is this why you brought your sister to Ramsgate, Mrs. Darcy? Because you could not marry her off in town? Elizabeth drew herself up and said, I invited my family here to enjoy the seaside and to celebrate my mother's birthday. I beg your pardon, Miss Elliot, but unless there is something that I have missed, my sister has shown no improper interest in Captain Wentworth or any other man since arriving in Kent. Please explain these most irregular accusations. At once. Elizabeth Darcy's tone was forbidding. Gladly, Mrs. Darcy. Miss Elliot tossed her curls and looked at Mary disdainfully. Since this spinster joined us in Ramsgate, she has watched my brother endlessly and taken every opportunity to place herself in his path to converse with him quietly, conversations that she is careful not to have overheard by the rest of us. When she visits other houses, the calculating schemer finds ways to have the place cards rearranged before dinner, seating herself near him at every opportunity. Lady Dalrymple has experienced this, and I have seen the confusion on the faces of Mrs. Croft and even Mrs. Darcy when Miss Bennet seats herself next to my brother at the table. I did that, confessed Mrs. Musgrove in a small voice. When everyone looked at her inquiringly, she shrugged, looked at the captain, and said, I think she is simply delightful, Wentworth. She then looked to Elizabeth and Lady Dalrymple and said, I do beg my hostess's pardon. Elizabeth put up her hands in a comforting gesture, as Mrs. Hayter, outraged for her friend, exclaimed, It is rich for you to call Mary Bennet a spinster, Miss Elliot, when you are years older than her. So many years I have quite forgotten the number. I have chosen not to marry. One of us must look after our father, and I have my dowry to sustain me. Miss Elliot sniffed and looked at Mary scornfully. Unlike Miss Bennet, who I understand comes with practically nothing. She is desperate. I am not. That does not change the fact that Miss Bennet is throwing herself at my brother, and I will not have it. I have too much regard for my late sister's credit. Her child deserves to be brought up by a woman of grace and refinement, and I will have my say in the matter. Elizabeth Elliot, you would not know a woman of grace and refinement if she struck you upon the nose with her fan, shouted Louisa Bennet. How dare you insult our friend? She's worth 12 of you, and so was Anne. I cannot but agree. Wentworth's countenance was forbidding as he scowled at his late wife's sister. Miss Bennet has not pursued me in the slightest, Miss Elliot, but I will have you know that your sister approved of her thoroughly, and I am in complete agreement with Mrs. Musgrove. Miss Bennet is utterly delightful. There was a gasp of excitement from Mrs. Bennet on the other side of the room. Is that so? Cried Miss Elliot, also jumping from her chair. Well, I will have all of you know that your darling Miss Bennet is so proper. She is exchanging letters with an unmarried gentleman. What would Anne think of that? I beg your pardon, objected Mary. Mrs. Darcy, you asked if there was something you missed. Indeed there is. Yes, Mrs. Darcy, just this very afternoon I observed you miss the moment when your sister, Miss Bennet, gave my brother a packet of letters on the beach. Miss Elliot informed the room, and everyone looked at Mary Bennet, obviously wondering if she, of all ladies, could have been corresponding improperly with a man. Chapter 8. Do you mean this packet of letters? Asked Wentworth darkly, pulling the very packet in question from his breast pocket. The very same, Miss Elliot crowed. The room hushed as Wentworth walked over to his sister and handed her the packet. Read one, he ordered. Mrs. Croft untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes skimming the page, before they flew wide. Why, it is from Anne. Anne? Everyone in the room echoed as they drew closer. Mrs. Wentworth had not been much valued by her father until after she had died, after which time he referred to her as if she were a saint, much as he did her mother. Everyone else who had known Anne Elliot Wentworth had loved and missed her dearly. Miss Bennet was my wife's friend, and they kept a correspondence. She gave me the letters that Anne wrote to her to bring me, and later my daughter, comfort. Wentworth glared at Miss Elliot. How dare you insinuate something so improper about such a kind gesture? Everyone glared at Miss Elliot, even Darcy, Bingley, and Lady Dalrymple, as Miss Elliot said helplessly, "Those are letters from my sister." Even Miss Elliot missed Mrs. Wentworth dreadfully, though she had been mercilessly unkind to her sister during her lifetime. They are. And it just occurred to me that since Miss Bennet says the letters are not private in nature, perhaps everyone would like to hear them. If someone will read them aloud. Wentworth cleared his throat, gruffly. I fear I may not be equal to such a task. I would like very much to hear letters written by my daughter Anne, said Sir Walter, very seriously. Oh, yes, please, perhaps after dinner, cried Mrs. Bennet. But we must not take command of Mrs. Darcy's evening. It would be unpardonably rude, squeaked Mrs. Hayter, looking at her hostess in alarm. I met Mrs. Wentworth only a few times, but she was a kind and agreeable lady, Elizabeth said. I know my sister valued her friendship highly, and I would not find it at all disagreeable to hear from her tonight or any other night. Elizabeth rose from her chair and approached Miss Elliot. But you, Miss Elliot, you will not hear any letter in my drawing-room nor sup at my table until you give my sister a whole-hearted and genuine apology. Miss Elliot looked around at the glares in the room. Everyone was scowling at her harshly. Miss Bennet, it appears I was mistaken. Please understand that my regard for my sister's credit is sincere. I truly thought that you were exchanging forbidden correspondence, and thought to protect my niece. I am uncertain what kind of apology that is meant to be, Elizabeth began insistently, but Mary interrupted her. I forgive you, Miss Elliot. Like you, I have a great regard for Anne Wentworth's credit. Mary smiled at Mrs. Musgrove as that woman came closer and put her arm around Mary comfortingly. The company all rose at the butler's entry and went into dinner. Mary was, of course, seated once again next to the captain. Everyone looked at Mrs. Musgrove as Wentworth seated her by his side, and Mrs. Musgrove blushed and tittered a bit. Mary's brothers, Darcy and Bingley, saved the day, in Mary's opinion, taking charge of the conversations directly, introducing other topics, and drawing the other guests into various discussions. She was nervous now that her affinity for her friend's husband had been discussed openly in company, and since he had announced to the room that he agreed with Mrs. Musgrove that she was utterly delightful. "Will you look at me?" he asked her quietly. When she gazed up at him, he said, I must find a way to thank Mrs. Musgrove, and perhaps even Miss Elliot. When Mary expressed confusion, he broke into a brilliant smile and said, I wished to court you, but I knew not how to break the ice. I think you will agree, Miss Bennet, that the ice has been thoroughly broken. Mary laughed out loud at this, as her sisters and their husbands kept the attention of the other guests mostly on other conversations. Do you think she would have approved? Mary asked him worriedly, thinking about Anne Wentworth. Somehow I think she would, he answered thoughtfully. I cannot explain it, but I feel she would thoroughly approve. The two of them were momentarily distracted by Sir Walter once again making a spectacle of praising Mrs. Bennet. Good God. Wentworth shook his head in bemusement. Then, turning back to her, he said, Miss Bennet, I believe that it is high time that you and I had a forthright conversation about our feelings, but I believe that privacy is called for in this matter. May I call upon you for a walk upon the shore tomorrow? The rest of the night, after the gentlemen joined the ladies, was spent with everyone completely engrossed, as Mrs. Croft read Anne's letters aloud and Elizabeth served cups of tea. There were many amusing accounts of memories that those present had shared with Anne Wentworth, and much laughter, as well as more than a few sentimental tears, were shared by her friends and family. Thank you, Miss Bennet, for this night of remembering my sister. I shall always recall your kindness. Mrs. Mary Musgrove embraced Mary warmly as her party left late that night. Chapter 9. Tuesday, 29th July, 1817. Happy birthday, my dear, a familiar voice whispered in her ear as Fanny Bennet looked out over the preparations for the garden party that would serve later that day as both a celebration of her birthday and also the wedding breakfast of her third daughter. "Thomas!" Fanny cried, turning and throwing her arms about her husband's neck. "I did not think you would come. I thought we would come home and find the letter with the plans for the wedding unopened upon your desk." "Silly woman," he chuckled. "Of course I knew about the wedding. That impressive captain that Mary Court came to Meryton and asked for my blessing." "Lizzie and I wrote to you thrice," Fanny said sternly, her hands upon her hips. "You did not even arrive when Darcy wrote to say he had rare books brought here for your inspection." "That is because I was in town, preparing to attend my daughter's wedding and my wife's birthday party. Congratulations on attaining your heart's desire, Fanny. I know how important it is to you. You have done very well by our daughters, my dear." "You did not come for the books?" Fanny faltered. "I came for you, my dear. And because my son Darcy tells me that I have competition. Who is this Walter Elliot? Shall I call him out?" Bennet puffed out his chest. Fanny tittered. "He is a most silly man. For all of my complaints regarding your scholarly nature, I will take a baker's dozen of you over that pretentious, preening peacock." She stepped back and looked him up and down. "Thomas, you are looking rather fine. Have you trimmed your whiskers? Where did you get such clothes? Your hair is so short." Bennet laughed. "When my son Darcy informed me that I must compete for your favours with a pretentious preening peacock, I thought that I had better be prepared. I visited our brother in Gracechurch Street, where he took me to a tailor who had many pieces ready to wear, and it was short work to have the final alterations completed." "You did that for me?" Fanny said in awe. "I went for another reason as well," he told her. "My brother introduced me to a tradesman from whom I purchased an important gift for a lady who is celebrating a very special day." "Oh, Thomas, how lovely of you to go to town and buy Mary a gift. You are right, she deserves something special for waiting so long and being the last to wed. She has Grandmamma Bennet's pearls today, but a pair of eardrops would be perfect. You are clever." Fanny clapped her hands. Bennet threw back his head and laughed. "You are truly England's silliest wife, darling Fanny. You are correct, I did think of that, and I did make a purchase for Mary's special day. But the reason I went was for you, my dear." He lifted a case from his side and opened it to reveal a beautiful gold chain with a pink, topaz, and citrine pendant. "Thomas! You cannot have bought such a gift for me. It is too much," Fanny protested, her eyes filling with tears. "It is exactly enough," he assured her. "And when we leave here next week, we shall travel to Bath for the wedding trip we never took. I would usually detest the crowds, but the fashionable abandon the place in the summer, so it ought to be a grand adventure for you and fairly tolerable for me." Fanny drew back and eyed him carefully. "You cannot have been that worried about Sir Walter." "You are still a very handsome woman, Mrs. Bennet. Perhaps I am safe in Meryton, but henceforth I shall accompany you on all of your travels and duel all the men who attempt to take you away." Bennet smiled down on her, then looked about the garden. "Is everything prepared for Mary's wedding? Our Lizzie has outdone herself." "Oh, Mary will be exceedingly happy to hear you have come to give her away, and someone must tell Mrs. Bennet to hurry with that bouquet she is assembling." Fanny started to rush off, but then turned back. "What about Mary's present? May I look?" "You must give it to her for me while she prepares for her day." He handed her the small box. She opened it to find a stunning pair of pearl drop earrings. His wife flashed him a beaming smile and rushed into the house. Happy for all of her maternal feelings was Fanny Bennet on the day she received her most fervent birthday wish. With what delighted pride did she turn about the garden on the arm of her husband, who was looking uncommonly handsome in his new suit of clothes and with his new haircut and neatly trimmed whiskers. The newly married Captain and Mrs. Wentworth were incandescently happy and rode away after the breakfast in Captain Wentworth's carriage on their way to Hampshire for a month alone in a small cottage in the remote countryside. Mrs. Croft was happy to keep little Anne with her for the duration of their absence. When Mary and Wentworth returned, Mary would commence her duties as a new mother. As Fanny stood with her two eldest and her husband, watching the carriage vanish from sight, Elizabeth said, "I congratulate you, Mamma. You said this garden party would serve as Mary's wedding breakfast, and so it did. I am certain I could not imagine a better birthday gift for you." Fanny Bennet looked up at her husband and smiled. "I knew how it would be." Epilogue. Wednesday, 29th July, 1818. Fanny Bennet sat up in her bed on her 47th birthday, holding her new son, as her husband was invited into the room by their two eldest daughters. "Fanny, I cannot believe that you did it," Mr. Bennet whispered in awe. He sat beside his wife on the bed, and she transferred their son to his arms. "He looks just like Lizzie did, do you remember?" Fanny remembered only too well the day her second-born had been placed in her arms, wearing an intelligent expression and a shocking quantity of dark hair. It had not occurred to her that day that it would take her 27 more years to accomplish her intention of bearing a son and heir for Longbourn. It may never have happened if not for Sir Walter and her husband's unaccountable streak of territorial possessiveness. His insecurity had made her see him as she did when they were young, and their month in Bath had been magical for both of them. When they finally returned home to Longbourn and their quiet house, it had been just like their first days as a married couple, and they had behaved as such until Fanny began feeling ill in the mornings. "Well, perhaps we did carry on several months beyond that." She giggled, causing her husband to raise his brow at her. "It was just a very private thought." She winked at him. "Mrs. Bennet, you are incorrigible." Her husband chuckled. "I cannot believe we are hearing this," Elizabeth announced in horror, covering her ears. "Do the pair of you wish for Irish twins? Because those looks are how a woman finds herself with Irish twins," said Jane sternly. Jane had no room to speak, for she had a set of Irish twins herself, having given birth again only 6 months before. "What shall we call him?" asked Bennet. "Would you like to name him Thomas?" asked Fanny. "That is far too generous, my dear, for the greatest share of the burden has been yours, and he even shares your birthday. He ought to be Henry for your father, but I have a better idea, for you deserve more than anyone to be honored. Let us call him Francis," Bennet insisted. "Happy birthday, Mamma and Francis," Jane and Elizabeth chorused. Fanny shed a few tears, and their daughters left them alone to contemplate their new situation. She laid her head back upon her husband's shoulder. "I knew how it would be." The end. You have been listening to How It Would Be, a Pride and Prejudice birthday variation by Caroline Cartier. Read by Harry Frost. Text and production copyright 2025 by Caroline Cartier.